Hi, my name is Paul Worthington. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Lindamood-Bell Learning Processes. Today we're going to talk about the frontiers of research on human learning, and this is going to be the first in a series of presentations from the Research and Development Department here at Lindamood-Bell. Specifically today we're going to cover language comprehension and autism. Just a little bit of history. When Nancy Bell, our current CEO, and Pat Lindamood began their initial inquiries now nearly 3 decades ago on what it really means to be able to read and comprehend and so forth, they began their practice sort of in a what might be termed a phenomenological approach in studying human learning, and specifically in the area of reading. And the legitimacy of their mind experiments ultimately led to where we are now here at Lindamood-Bell. And it was based initially on case studies that are associated with individuals who couldn't read and individuals who read really, really well. And this process really was engaged in the discovery and or the knowing of things firsthand, first person, if you will. As one of the fathers of phenomenology has been quoted in numerous occasions, it's just the observation of things in themselves. So what did these discoveries lead to? It led to what we refer to here at Lindamood-Bell as process-based education, and what is now known as Lindamood-Bell's sensory cognitive programs. Specifically, our research has landed on the critical factor of the role of mental representations and what is going on from a neurological or a brain-based standpoint and how it is that we make sense of the world around us, and specifically in the area of reading. And where mental representations are concerned, it has to do with the nonverbal code for language and cognition, or thinking, which includes, of course, the ability to comprehend language. The program that ultimately evolved out of Nancy's experimentations with things in themselves, and maybe the best way to refer to that is students in themselves and what it is that they can or can't do, had to do with a development, ultimately led with the development of a program called Visualizing and Verbalizing. Just a little more on our research history and tradition. Coupled with the direct observations of learning behaviors, our research expanded in attempting to understand how it is that we create memories, how it is that we comprehend language. And during the evolution of Nancy's case studies, or her experiments with the phenomena of reading, and specifically of comprehension, we discovered the work of Dr. Alan Pavio and his propositions about making meaning, and what it is that he calls dual coding theory. And so our alignment with the radical different theory of mind, with a different theory of mind at the time regarding the teaching of reading in the primary mental code for all learning. His proposition is that cognition is proportional to the extent that the coding mechanisms of mental representations, or loosely interpreted what we might call imagery, and language are integrated. His research led to the formation of dual coding theory, a general theory of cognition in which the Visualizing and Verbalizing program conveniently, or from a research standpoint, based on Nancy's case studies, fit very elegantly. Dr. Pavio quotes, "Performance is mediated by the joint activity of verbal and nonverbal systems. Cognition is always an interplay between the verbal and the nonverbal systems." If you will, just read the imaginal systems. Pavio suggested that linguistic competence, for example in the area of language comprehension, and performance are based on a substrate of imagery. He says that individuals differ in the extent, the manner, and the efficiency of employment of each of the systems according to their verbal and nonverbal habits and skills. So when we look at the populations of students that we've been serving here at Lindamood-Bell, and not thriving in, let's just call it compulsory education, How do we apply this theory of mind, this theoretical model, to the students that come into Lindamood-Bell? To give you some perspective on this, if we look from the year 2008 to 2015 and we parse out or look at the full range of students that we work with, what you'll see from this slide is that on the comprehension slide, or the comprehension component, purely 25% of all the students that we see exclusively have an issue with regard to substandard comprehension skills. And if you look at the addition of that 12%, or what's noted there in green, that's another 12% that not only do students have some form of comprehension, but they need some support in their decoding. Conversely, 43% of the kids that we see, or for that matter, individuals of all ages that we see, have pure decoding problems, and if you add 20% to that, you'll see that the students who have predominantly a decoding problem indeed also need some comprehension support. On this compulsory pipeline, if we take a little deeper look just to contrast the kinds of students that we see and the gains that we make before we dive into what it is that we're doing with kids on the spectrum, this is a slide that takes a look at that. If you look at the black line on what we'll just refer to as compulsory education and children going from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, and then you look at the red line that shows, for example, children's word recognition skills at the time we test them, having been identified as having deficits in the area of word recognition skills. And then you look at the overall progress that we make on a variety of tests after an average of approximately 100 hours of intervention. You see that we're making approximately 2 years of gains over that 100 hours of intervention. Look at it in terms of their ability to read fluently. It's the same issue. They come in with a deficit, and then after a couple or 100 hours of intervention, we're getting approximately a 1.5 year gain in a number of areas, in this case, specifically in the area of fluency. Now to the subject at hand, language comprehension. If you look at, again, the black line on where students are in terms of their age and grade level as compared to where their comprehension pretest score is, and let's just pick a particular grade level. Let's say students who are approximately in the 8th or 9th grade, from a compulsory standpoint, their comprehension is cutting out essentially at the 7th grade, second month. And after, again, approximately 100 hours of intervention, their comprehension is improved up to grade level. Well, is that possible for children on the spectrum? What we know is that as you look at the pre and post test scores, again, going back to the decoding students, we see extraordinary gains in a range of skills that are related to students who have predominantly just decoding problems. If we use this as a template, we ask ourselves, can we get this kind of progress as compared to students who have decoding issues for students who have language comprehension deficits? If you look at it from a standard score standpoint, you see all these large gains, for example, in their ability to develop word attack skills. They have a standard score gain of 15.3. They have a standard score gain in terms of their ability to read accurately of 9.7. Again, now these are only decoding students. If we take a look at comprehension students, which is more closely aligned to the kinds of students that we're interested in that are on the spectrum, here are the pre and post percentile gains associated with, for example, a student's ability, and these are just average students who come in who have, as it turns out, have one of those comprehension deficits that we address in a clinical setting using the Visualizing and Verbalizing program. If we look at students on their ability to follow oral directions. They enter in at the 13th percentile, which simply means that they're on average doing better than only 13% of the other students, their age and or grade level. And at the post-testing, they're at the 30th percentile on average, which means we're normalizing this population of children. So knowing all these numbers relative to the garden variety of children and or adults that come in who receive our intensive clinical intervention in our programs that are related specifically to decoding, or the visualizing, in this case in the Visualizing and Verbalizing program that's related to students who have comprehension deficits. What can we expect for students who have comprehension deficits? On the comprehension side, if we looked at it from a standard score standpoint, again, looking at the students come in, we're expecting a standard score change of about 9.4. These are statistically significant or very large gains from a statistical standpoint in addressing the needs of children who have comprehension deficits. So, in addition to just another tidbit of history as it relates to all the work that we've done leading up to the current studies that I'm going to talk to you about in working with children on the spectrum. We worked with Georgetown and Wake Forest, MIT. We're currently engaged in a study with Stanford with dyslexic students. And by the way, the MIT and the Georgetown studies were also with dyslexic students. We've kind of got to the point we're saying we need to get out of, or in addition to doing this decoding only research, and address the issues of comprehension from a neuroscience standpoint, specifically in this case in the realm of autism. And so out of an association with Carnegie Mellon and the University of Alabama in Birmingham, we decided to dive into this research with children on the autism spectrum. Where do they fit? Well, we know what's called the comorbidity between children who are on the autism spectrum and children who also have language comprehension deficits is extremely high. That is to say, there's a strong relationship between their ability to comprehend oral and written language, as well as the classic symptoms that are associated with being on the spectrum. Do you think that this is an important policy perspective? As it turns out, it is. Indeed, I've just lifted a quote out of a recent article that the U.S. Department of Education reports that much research has been conducted over the last 20 years that addresses ways to remediate reading difficulties in general for the regular population, but little research has been completed with high-functioning children with autism spectrum disorders. In other words, there's a huge gap in the research. Studies that test reading strategies are especially important because of the number of children with autism spectrum disorders. And so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention just reported, and many of you may be familiar with these recent statistics that suggest that as many as 1 in 50 children are now diagnosed with ASD, and this goes back to data from 2013. So the challenge is before us. Can we address in a very specific way these language comprehension deficits for students with autism? Part of the justification before we started the research on the neuroscience side of things was we took a look at the population of students that we've had come into our centers across the country who have been previously diagnosed with autism. What you see here, again, for the years 2008 through 2015, is that we had worked with 570 children who had been previously diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. And what you see here is our research on what we have found in terms of affecting the profile of these children on the spectrum. And most specifically, it looks like we've been able to take children from the 7th to, on average, the 18th percentile on their language comprehension score. And if we look at it from a standard score change, it is almost comparable to the same kinds of standard score changes that we're getting with students who are not on the spectrum, but who are yet experiencing difficulties with their language comprehension. So that provided the impetus to go ahead with the research at the University of Alabama. At the University of Alabama, in their Neuroimaging Research efforts, particularly in the Department of Psychology there, in the Center for Cognition, Brain, and Autism Laboratory, we began an investigation of how we might engage with these students. And so the researchers studied the impact of the VV program on the brain circuitry and the connectivity in children with autism spectrum disorders. And perhaps a word about specific, other than just the theoretical part, a word about visualizing and verbalizing. Clearly put, visualizing and verbalizing is a practitioner's code using a process-based educational approach developed by Nancy Bell to specifically address the symptoms that are classically associated with language comprehension deficits. It's a sensory cognitive program and pedagogy that addresses the underlying deficits in children's ability to comprehend what it is that they're reading and or hearing. And it's based upon the principle of dual coding theory, explicitly stimulating the brain to integrate the use of imagery and language towards increasing memory, comprehension, language expression, and overall intellectual performance. So really what we're engaged in here is the testing of the dual coding theory of cognition. It's a measurement to see whether or not this theory of mine, as applied to children on the spectrum, will fit in terms of being able to look at their pre and post profile, not only in terms of whether or not they're comprehending better, but also looking at the biological basis of it, which is an impaired conductivity in the white matter of the brain and the communication pathways, the axons, the dendrites, the lipids, or the fatty tissue necessary to pass signals on from one area of the brain to the other. I should say that part of the secondary hypothesis of this research and why it is that we were interested in pursuing this had to do with research at Carnegie Mellon and the University of Alabama that the primary symptom that's associated with children on the spectrum is that they have this underconnectivity in the pathways of the brain that are associated with being able to, for example, to put verbal information, what they read, what they hear, into those areas of the brain that are necessary to generate mental imagery. And as it turns out, what Nancy has entitled as concept imagery, or a concept imagery weakness, turns out to match almost in parallel the exact sort of symptoms that children on the spectrum have in their language comprehension areas as well. Specifically, as itemized here, oral and written language comprehension, critical thinking difficulties with logical and abstract thinking, the impaired abilities to follow oral directions, deficit in expressing language orally and in writing form, difficulty with social skills, grasping humor, cause and effect considerations, attention, focus, the ability to, or the inability to conduct mental mapping and responding in general in the communication world. So this is where we landed, studying the impact of VV, or visualizing and verbalizing, on the brain circuitry and the conductivity in children with autism. Two papers, to cut right to the conclusions on this, two papers have been published and they're itemized here on the findings of this investigation. How did the research work? We took 31 children with autism who were randomly assigned to an experimental and a control group. In other words, the experimental group got visualizing and verbalizing. The control group had no intervention. There were 16 and 15 respectively. What you see here, that their ages were fairly well matched. The gender was almost identical. Their full-scale IQ, as measured on the WAIS intelligence test, were comparable. The GORT comprehension scores were statistically similar, as was their word recognition scores as measured on the Slauson oral reading test. So in other words, the groups were similar on all variables. That enabled us then to do a match control to see if the experimental group going through the VV would have any gains that were significantly better than the control group. So in phase 1, all the children were scanned in a functional imaging machine to take a look at all those areas in the brain that should be communicating with one with another. They subsequently received neuropsychological assessments, and then in phase 2, they were tested again after the children went through the intensive intervention using the Visualizing and Verbalizing program. They received the brain scans, the fMRIs. They would administer, for example, the gray oral reading test. These children were seen 5 days a week for 10 weeks. So what we're looking at is the pre to post test brain and behavioral test to look at both the neurological changes as well as the behavioral changes in their language comprehension. Here are the behavioral tests on the language comprehension. The experimental test, when you look at the percent change in the gray oral reading test on the comprehension score as compared to the control, we were actually quite stunned at the significant progress that the children with autism experienced as a result of the children in the control group. And when we looked at the change in the brain conductivity, one of the interesting and actually fascinating findings was that there was greater conductivity in the experimental group as compared to the control group at post-test. So what we have is comparatively is two forms of evidence that not only did we see the behavioral changes that were significant for the children who went through the experimental Visualizing and Verbalizing program, but we had extraordinary changes at a neurophysiological level that showed greater conductivity in those areas that were associated from pre to post-test. Overall, this study, when we look at changes in the intrinsic activities in the human brain, revealed widespread changes in the functional connectivity of the brain's reading network as a result of the intervention, in this case, visualizing and verbalizing. Therefore, the findings of the study, which are extremely interesting on the impact of the reading intervention, supports the principles of dual coding theory, the theory of mind that we talked about at the initial outset of this presentation. And it suggests the potential of a strength-based, as quoted in this particular paper, of this reading intervention, visualizing and verbalizing, and changing the brain responses to facilitating better reading comprehension in children with autism spectrum disorders. I'd like to offer just a couple final thoughts at a global level that's associated with what we need to consider overall, not only for children on the spectrum, as we look further into our investigations of all the variables that are associated with human learning. We know there are primary variables, and it not only relates to the children that we just talked about on the spectrum, but all the children that we see at Lindamood-Bell learning processes. We have to control and understand through differential diagnosis what's necessary for the children if they're exhibiting at-risk learning behaviors. Number two, once we know what those diagnostic protocols are, we absolutely have to have customized interventions, just as we've done for these children that we just talked about on the spectrum. And three, there's an important consideration in understanding the environmental or the adaptation and modification variables that need to take place. One of the things that I just briefly noted in this study, which is what we do in all of our clinical operations in Lindamood-Bell, is that not only do we have to have a good differential diagnosis, we must have customized interventions, but one of the primary environmental variables that we know has to take place, if a child is more than 1 year behind or 1 standard deviation behind their age and or grade level, not only do they need the right interventions with the right diagnosis, but we need to do it intensively, which is what we did with these children on the spectrum. And as you see those A, B, C, and D factors, I'll just mention one more. One of the other primary factors that we know that's critical from an environmental standpoint is there has to be extremely highly qualified teachers who are working with the children. In other words, there has to be extreme competencies in addressing the needs of children who are having their needs met and associated with whatever their diagnosis is. I'll thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. And we're going to follow that up through the course of the year with 3 other presentations based on continuing research that we have going with other universities and in association with other professionals addressing the needs of children who have language processing deficits. Thank you.